If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list?
Panther 48.
Willing to die for.
Panther 48.
Willing to die for. How long is your list?
What is the tribal self?
Panther
The
48.
tribal self is what goes above the immediate acquaintances of the social.
Willing to die
The
for.
family, the people you know, live next door.
You would be willing
I'm
to
talking about
die for.
tribal self.
Panther 48.
I'm talking about those movies, those yet unborn, and those who are the
How
ancestors.
long is your list?
So the connection with the ancestors is tied into the tribal self.
Panther 48.
What does that mean? That means that the tribal self constantly reminds us
Willing to die for.
that we don't have the
How
right
long is your
to
list?
claim independence.
Panther 48.
Peace and power. Once again, this your Panther 48. This your big brother site, calling out of Dallas, Texas. I am the author of the Brother Site YouTube channel. So if you're into building on manhood training and manhood development, and you're not subscribed to the channel, go subscribe to the channel. If you love the content we bring here, then you need to make sure that you subscribe to the Panther 48 channel. Sitting with me are the other brothers, other members of the Panther 48. I got brother Robert Ward Williams calling out of San Diego, California, who is the chairman of the San Diego chapter of the Black Panther Party and chief of staff of national chief of staff of the People's Black Panther Party, headquartered out of Atlanta, Georgia. Peace and power, brother Ward.
All power to people, to those who that deserve it.
We got I got my minister emeritus of the Panther 48 and one of the original members of the original new Black Panther Party. It always sounds funny when I say it, brother E, who we got calling out of Florida.
Greetings.
I got a special guest on the panel tonight who have been here with us so many times that they almost not guests no more. They're almost like they're at home. We got brother Rich calling out of San Antonio, Texas, a member of the Uhuru Shule training systems and a student in the 5% of teachers. Peace, brother Rich.
Man, peace and all power, man. Let's get to the beeswax. I'm ready.
Indeed. And we got a special guest, brother Robert Lilly, a member and representative of the Texas Advocates for Justice. We affectionately call him brother Rob, and he is going to be doing the majority of the teaching and building on this session today. Peace, brother Rob.
Peace and blessing to my beloved brothers and sisters.
No doubt.
Brother, for a quick minute, for those who don't know what the TAJ is, the Texas Advocates for Justice, can you tell them what that organization is and what the purpose of the organization?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So Texas Advocates for Justice is a program within Grassroots Leadership, which is a national organization headquartered here in Austin, Texas, with a chapter in Houston, Texas, and intentions to expand. TAJ, or Texas Advocates for Justice, is a base building platform designed to bring into a unified formation men and women, families that have been affected by mass incarceration, those that have been incarcerated, those who have been impacted by having a loved one incarcerated. We teach folk how to use their stories for the purpose of effecting change in our society on the local level, on the regional level, and on the national level. And so that's in a nutshell what this organization is about.
All right, we appreciate that, brother. Today's conversation, we decided to build on the concept of addiction. We decided to build on that because addiction affects the Black community in many ways, and it also affects people going to prison. It affects people being able to find a good bearing on land once they release from prison. And as as many of us brothers can testify to, it also affects the ability to operate properly and functionally in a family. So we're going to get on the subject, not just building on addiction. We're going to build on the history of drug use. We're going to build on the evolution of addiction. We're going to build on some of the causes and some of the ends of addiction, and we're going to build on recovery. But for right now, I'm going to pass the mic to Brother Rob so he can start out by getting us a history of addiction. Your mic is hot, Brother Rob.
Peace and blessings once again to all of my brothers here this evening and anyone else that's going to avail themselves of this particular production. My hope and my prayer is that the information that we give tonight is verifiable, that you can go research it for yourself in the history, because without knowledge of our history, we will not know where we've been, and we will not understand what's happening today, nor where we're going. So this evening, I want to basically talk from a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, as I consider myself a person in recovery. And what that essentially means is that I'm retaking and my life as it has been ravaged by the negative influences of substance use disorder and white supremacy. I say and white supremacy because I cannot talk about my history with substance use disorder, also known as addiction, without talking about the realities that have shaped my life. Every one of our lives has a context in which it is created, and no different with my life. When I was in prison years ago, I remember having this ongoing conversation. I was much younger in my years. And I remember having this ongoing conversation with a young man who told me, well, your mother and your father taught you right. And I remember that comment, that critique, that criticism being a little disturbing for me, because, and again, I didn't have the sophisticated analysis to respond more effectively. So inwardly, I had a lot of emotions that were surfacing when I heard him say to me, my fate, my being in prison, my being a person who's still at that time struggling with addiction and trying to get through to the other side, that all of this was a result of my not having listened to my mother and my father, who taught me right, that I knew and I should have done better. So again, I bring that up to say this. In the world of psychology, there is a concept called attributional theory. And the idea of attributional theory is that one's attitude and one's response to a problem is influenced by who and how they attribute the problem to, or who they and what they attribute the problem to. So with that said, just giving you a little bit of a foundation before we go into the history, my life was not just shaped by my mother and my father. My mother, and then I mean, furthermore, this gentleman who made this critique, he made a lot of assumptions in it. Now, I remember at the time, I didn't even have the word assumption in my vocabulary, so I couldn't even properly respond to him with what it meant to have an assumption. But he was assuming that my mother and my father knew right and wrong, and that they were teaching me right and wrong, and that I heard everything that they said that was right and wrong. And because I heard that I would have the choice to do what was right, and I would avoid what's wrong. There's a lot of assumptions in that. He doesn't, number one, he never stopped to ask me what was my family history. Number two, he assumed that my mother and father had information that was considered right, or that people would generally qualify as right, and that they were teaching me that, and to avoid these things that they generally considered wrong. That was all fallacious. The reality was that in my household, there was what we now call dysfunctionality. Without going into all the details of that, just suffice to say, I had loving parents, but I had parents who themselves were raised and shaped in a social context. I was born in 1970. My father was born in 1924. My mother, I cannot tell you when she was born because she passed when I was 80 years old, but that in itself tells you something about my context. Her presence in our home was removed after a period of time as a result of untimely death from kidney failure. So my parents had a history and I had a history. In order to understand this phenomenon of addiction, I believe it is absolutely essential to inquire about the history of a person and a people. I believe that what's happened today, as we've discussed this issue in other contexts, we often want to isolate the individual from the context of his environment. And when we do that, we put all the onus for change on the individual, when no individual is a self-creation. Every one of us is influenced by factors, circumstances, institutions, and relationships. There's no way in the world that I can acquire ideas unless an idea exists in the world. Somebody has to put that idea in the world first. then I embrace it, or I reject it, or I explore it until I decide whether or not I want to accept it. Oftentimes we attribute this phenomenon of addiction to the individual to the exclusion of every other influence in the world. And I'm here tonight to tell you that we have to stop that kind of behavior because it is not getting us any closer to a solution. In fact, it is further harming us because we're alienating people because we attribute to them the sole cause of their problem. And hence, another point that I want to make before I launch into the history. At that same point in time when I was arguing with this gentleman in TDCJ in my early 20s, I could not distinguish between a personal problem and a social problem. So when this gentleman was telling me that my problem was the result of my turning away from what I knew was right, I couldn't properly respond to him. I just felt an emotion that disturbed me because I was unsettled by his answer because intuitively, I knew it was more complicated than that, although I hadn't put all the ideas together yet. I would go to school and I would learn in my sociology class that there's two problems in this world. One is a social problem and the other one is a personal problem. A personal problem is a problem defined by sociologists is that which originates in the self, and it can be, and the solution can be drawn from within the self.
Okay.
A social problem. Pardon me, do you want to say something, brother, or were you just agreeing?
I was
Okay.
just agreeing.
A social problem, however, is quite distinct from a personal problem, and whether or not we see a thing as a social problem or a personal problem, it carries great weight in terms of how we approach resolving an issue. So a social problem is a problem in which the origins of the problem do not exist within the individual, although it may affect the individual. It is drawn from the reality of the society around them. It's a social problem. And the solution to that social problem can only be acquired by finding a social solution, a collective strategy, right? So let's say, for example, I get fired from my job. And you ask me, what happened, Brother Rob? And you find out, well, I was going late to work. That's a problem. And now I've got a personal problem. I don't have a job. When you ask me a little more questions, well, why were you going late to work? And you ask me that, and I answer, well, I was staying up late at night. That's a personal problem because everything that I'm describing to you derives from the choices that I'm making. However, let's use another man. He loses a job. You ask him what happened. And you find out that somebody in that company has embezzled, that's at the top of the company, embezzled that money from the company. And not only did he lose his job, but hundreds of other people lost their job. And now this company's folding and this entire community is going to be affected negatively because this corporation was a source of income for many households. That person is still affected individually on a personal level, but what he's dealing with, he can't resolve alone. He has to find support. It may be that he's going to take the corporation to court. He has to band with other people. Now, granted, he still needs to get a job, and at the end of the day, that's going to be something that he has to resolve. But I'm not trying to go into the weeds. I'm just pointing out that there's a context for every problem. Going to this addiction issue, there's a context for our problem. Let's go into history. African people have always had a relationship with things that we call today drugs, plants, medicines, we call them today medicines. We've always had a relationship to the earth in ways that we can use it for our benefit. There's never been a time in our history where we've not known how to ferment the berries and make what we now call beer. We've used these things for medicine, we use them for social purposes, and we use them for spiritual purposes. We've used them for transactions. That's always been the case. Historically, you can go back and you can find great tribes like the Igbos. You can find the Wedas. You can find the Mandingos. These tribes all have been reported to have had use and knowledge of how to manipulate berries to produce beer and other alcoholic beverages. That is nothing new. The problem that's not the problem, but what I want to say here is that historically, we have existed apart from Europeans. And when Europeans came into Africa, they introduced not only new forms of intoxicating beverages, but they also introduced guns or other forms of warfare, like the use of firearms. And they coupled that with the trade of other persons of African descent for the acquisition of alcoholic beverages. And what I'm trying to set up here with this small synopsis of our history is that we existed in our own land with this substance called alcohol, and we had other things that we smoked that are now known as marijuana, plants. We knew how to use the earth around us to give us a transformative effect from the substance, right? But when the European came into our lands, that dynamic was shifted. So we already had wars going on amongst us. That was not anything new. But with these Europeans coming in and adding that extra dynamic of firearms, these war captives that were once just kept in bondage in Africa were now being traded off through the transatlantic slave trade. This added a new complexity to the psychological issues that would then be the result of this transport of a people from one land to another. That has to be talked about. If you don't think that there was a psychological effect that resulted from being stripped of your land, being prohibited from having access to your faith concepts, being prevented from speaking your native tongue, I think you would be foolish. And you would be distorting history, and you would not be looking at the reality of our people with a clear and honest view. If we're going to talk about alcohol and drugs, and we're going to talk about our people, we've got to talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and we've got to talk about the knowledge that the fact that we had access to this chemical well before we existed here in these plains of North America. That said, once we got to the Americas, what happened? In the Americas, we were now under the total domination of our slave masters. We worked from sunup to sundown. We no longer had the liberty to create our own beverages in the manner that we traditionally used and consumed them. We didn't have the structure of our families. We didn't have the structure of our tribes. Matter of fact, many tribes were mixed together, and the work was so intense and so grueling that we were only given the privilege of access to relief on the weekends, and it was on the weekends that the slave master would give us access to alcohol. Apart from that, we had no permission to use alcohol. If we got caught with any beverages or drinking throughout the weekdays when we were supposed to be getting up for work, that was brutal punishment that you'd be experiencing. So what am I trying to point out with this small synopsis of our history? And again, we're just giving you snippets. In America, and particularly under chattel slavery, our bodies were not our own bodies. They belonged to the slave master. And the slave master controlled not only our bodies, but he controlled our time and our entertainment. So thus began a tradition of using alcohol on the weekends to party. And this is what you see today. You know, we live for the weekend. What do some people say? Thank God it's Friday. What do we want to do? Go get an outfit. We want to go out and we want to have some fun, because we've been saying we've been working all week on the plantation or corporate America. And there's some truth to that. It is a plantation. The point I'm trying to make, though, beyond that, is this European system, this Western system created by Europeans, dominated by Europeans, dominated by the slave masters, reshaped our relationship to the chemicals that we already had knowledge of in our historic context, Africa. We could only access it with his permission. We could only access it with his authority. And might I say also her authority, because the white woman was also complicit in chattel slavery. And so because we could only access it with their permission and authority, basically, we were no longer autonomous. We no longer had agency. The relationship to this chemical was now regulated by white people. Let's move forward a little bit. Chattel slavery is ended. We now have the period known as the Reconstruction. We have a time frame of about 15 to 20 years where we are subjected to a European redemption. Redemption was when the Europeans fought any progress that was made by African people of African descent. They subdued us. They basically relegated us once again to a form of total domination. And life in the South, which is where the majority of us live, became so hard and so brutal. We decided it was better to leave the South and make our way somewhere else. If you go back and if there's a book, this particular book is written by a gentleman who is a scholar out of New York City. He's a Muslim, but he's also over the Schomburg Museum. But it's called, the name of it eludes me at this particular moment. But the book is about the criminalization of African people. One of the things that you'll find when you look back at the history of our people, and maybe you could put it in the notes when this talk is over with, but one of the things that was characteristic of this time was that in order to justify re-enslaving us, abusing us, and basically murdering us, subjecting us to genocide, was that they said that we were uncivilized and that we could not control ourselves. And they pointed to our going to the clubs, they pointed to our going to the speakeasies, if you will, those holes in the wall places. And on the weekend in the South back in the days, in that Reconstruction era, there was a lot of drinking and there was a lot of cutting and there was a lot of fighting. And so those behaviors were pointed to as evidence that we weren't responsible enough for self-government, and therefore we should be once again put under the authority of the whites. Why is that important? Because that exactly did happen. Reconstruction was dismantled, white domination and white supremacy became prominent in the South again. And what happened? African people decided to migrate. They decided to leave. That's it, the condemnation of Blackness. Thank you very much, my brother. So Black folk were criminalized, as Khalid Muhammad says in his book, The Condemnation of Blackness. They were criminalized. They were told that, and the world was told, and it was, and our destruction and subjection to harsh treatment was rationalized and justified because they were primarily pointing to our substance use issues, how we use alcohol and how we party on the weekend, as it was originally ordered and controlled by them. So they put us back into a form of bondage. You had peonage, you had sharecropping. These manners of controlling our labor were so harsh that we could barely survive. The conditions became so constrictive, we decided to uproot ourselves from living in the South, and in the numbers that totaled into the hundreds of thousands, they changed the whole demographic of the South. We migrated from the South to the North. This is important, my brothers and sisters, because we can't talk about addiction without talking about history. Because every one of these major shifts in movement of our people from one location to the next, each one of these movements was still in proximity, or we still had some kind of contact with Europeans who controlled the society. So in the South, our working arrangements were controlled by Europeans. When we moved to the North, it was no different. The Europeans still remained. Now, we were called there because during World War II, this is when the majority of our migration from the South happened. The jobs, we needed jobs, factory jobs were available to us. We moved to the South. But the issue that's interesting when you read about this great migration is that we could only move to certain areas in the North. These areas became known as ghettos or slums. And these areas were so jam-packed. They were filthy, they were unkept, and it wasn't because we didn't like to live in clean environments. Again, this is important because you talk about a social problem versus a personal problem. Who and what we attribute the problem to affects how we respond to it. So the conditions that we moved into in the North weren't conditions that we created for ourselves. These were the conditions that were there for us that we had no option but to accept. You had overcrowded conditions, housing was few, we had large numbers of people living in the same dwelling, you had no city services. I mean, essentially, you had people living in conditions that were inhumane. Again, alcohol and drugs were now available to us. Mostly alcohol and opium at this time was available to us, and it became a manner by which we escaped our conditions for many of us. Not every single person that used it for that express reason initially, but when we look back at history, a large swath of our people were responding to conditions that were unbearable and finding relief on the weekends through going to the bar, drinking, and just letting loose was a much better option than enduring the reality of what we had to face every single day. I wanted to escape. I wanted to get away. I wanted to, quote unquote, let my hair down. But what came along with that was the same things that happened in the South. You had tensions rising, you had knives or you had guns, and you had violence. And what did this allow for? This allowed the European to come in with his police officers and to criminalize us and to justify putting us in prisons. Again, I bring that up to say you can't talk about addiction without talking about police authority and without talking about the way in which prisons have been used to destroy and control our people. And I emphasize the word control because in my worldview and in the way I look at this problem, prisons are a form of social control. Prisons are a form of social control, and our use of the chemical, which then creates a lack of inhibition, which puts us in a position to be quick to use violence, then justifies the way the system responds to us. And ultimately, they rationalize removing any options for us to self-government, and thus we become, again, his slaves.
Let me not necessarily talk about it from a history, but what I want to talk about it from is a point of awareness. So kind of like Rob was stating, Africans have always known how to utilize drugs in that way. But let me call it this. We didn't refer to things as drugs. Basically, what we were dealing with was medicines. Now, the difference between a medicine and a drug as it applies to that has to do with the purpose of it. When we talk about medicines from that standpoint, these are things that helps to enhance the natural operation of the body in order for it to produce a certain result, to allow us to conduct whatever operations or ways of life that we're doing. So from that standpoint, there were certain plants within our environment that allowed us to enhance our mental capacity, our state of awareness, and our spiritual connection. So these things we would call them psychoactive drugs or psychoactive plants and medicines. Psychoactive medicines basically allowed, for instance, like he referenced to the Zulus. The Zulu Impies would take a certain type of herb, of tree bark actually, and they would be able to use it to go into battle, and it helped them to be able to have strong levels of endurance, which is why they was able to literally run into battle for miles and miles on end and outdo a lot of opponents. So the point being is that we as Africans have always been in what I would refer to as one with nature, always to a position where things that we use would enhance our ability to be operating and in tune with nature. What makes things different, and I have to add to what he was saying, is that the application of deceit as a process of trade is what gave way to exploitation. That exploitation in itself became weaponized. And that's what we have to look at. The deal here is that once exploitation was commodified, now we talked about a weaponization of application. And once you create a mode and methodology of warfare toward the application of deceit and exploitation takes the center front, which is not a mentality or a mindset that Africans ever thought about being, is creating a concept of deceit and exploitation on a warring population. We never done that, never thought like that. That was just way out of the scope of how we thought. Once a society is able to operate from that standpoint, it gives way to where things naturally in harmony with nature that the people will use can be weaponized against that population. Let me fast forward a little bit and then I'll reverse back. Fast forward to a project I encourage everybody to take note of and study, MK Ultra. MK Ultra was a project that was basically set out to look into the experimentation and weaponization of drugs, of psychoactive drugs on the population. They started by looking at it in terms of African, not only just population, but primarily Africans and Black people. So the deal here is they actually studied our spiritual paths and our spiritual connections with these natural medicines and figured out how can we use this process that they naturally use to enhance their connection and be able to see things the way they are against and create a codependency. You see, when you have a system in place that's based upon the exploitation of weaponization as the commodity itself, then what you want to try to do now is separate a people's connection with themselves. So MK Ultra came in and basically figured out a way to where what we call now drug use can be used against a population, and how not only can it be used against a population, but that it can be used to destroy the spiritual connection that the people have. So you went from creating a situation where we were at one with our natural selves and found out ways to enhance the natural self and our natural position in society, to creating what's called an escape. An escape now is when you can take the same medication and you flip it around and you make it something called recreational. And you make it something that is used so that the population now would turn to this as a way to escape the realities of life, a way to escape the naturalizations of and the connections that we have through spiritual practice. Going back, what Syke was talking about is in certain African practices that I participated in terms of martial science, one of the things that we were taught is how to take certain types of mushrooms and use it to actually study martial science through a connection and through a psychoactive connection, to where you are learning techniques and you're learning skill sets without actually physically having to engage in them. So the use of these medicines would actually help us to enhance our state of awareness of warfare and how the vessel can manipulate itself for the sake of combat. The same thing was also studied with, again, in MK Ultra through the uses of LSD. LSD was actually studied and utilized at Harvard. A lot of people don't know. And part of the record is what was recognized and figured out with that goes right back to what I was saying about our African spiritual connection, is that we actually can have a higher state of awareness, and through these higher states of awareness can be way more innovative and way more connected to the world and the universe around us. And we can actually discover things that we can't physically, tangibly connect with on a physical level. Well, the deal is when you talk about being able to exploit these type of things and weaponize this against a population, now all of a sudden you come up with a way to control a population and control a people through the same things that the people would naturally do and normally do to enhance their ability and their awareness. So through MK Ultra, when this was implemented, the point was, how do you modify a human population to the point to where it is able to be suppressed in terms of its ability to operate and cohesively be able to challenge the warfare status that's going on. This is what also led rise to what we call the counterintelligence and counter consciousness operations. And I'm gonna double back a little bit more on that later. But let me just state this aspect. A lot of people don't put reference and interest in the fact that the program was called counterintelligence. Going back to what we talked about in terms of the African use of medicines that allowed a higher state of awareness and a higher level of spiritual connection, this led way to in-depth levels of intelligence and consciousness, which is why we were able to build structures and operate and do things that Europeans were not able to do. Mind you, one of the things that people don't talk about with them, I often talk about with African slave trade, is that it was not only were the Africans, were we able to deal with the harsh conditions of what they call the New World, but we also knew how we were master builders, and we were able to engineer and develop things that they did not know. So with that process led way to them, again, exploiting us and finding ways to, at this point in time, when we talk about counterintelligence, being able to utilize the same things that they used to exploit us. Now they wanted to suppress and neutralize our ability to be able to maintain and keep that connection. So then you turn around and you find ways to weaponize drugs against a population, and you cause a population to now go to these things and use them for suppression of their intelligence, which is the counterintelligence, counterconsciousness. So now the same thing that was used from a medicinal standpoint is actually used now as a drug. Is actually now a toxifying thing in terms of your connection to life and life around you. And from that standpoint, instead of you using it to enhance and have an operation of growth, it is being used as an escape. And when you use something out of its natural process and natural operation, you have turned that thing into something that is now being used against you as a weapon. It's no different than anything else we put in our system. You can take a small amount of something and it heals you, and you can take a large quantity of it and now it is destroying you. This is how something becomes, can be labeled can be labeled a food, and then turns into something that's harmful to the body. It is basically about dosage and our application. So when you change the application of our connection with what's referred to as drugs, then you basically put a population to sleep. So we went from basically being one with nature and our connection with plants, life, and everything that the earth that makes up the earth, to basically allowing it to be weaponized and used against us as a population, and also rip and destroy our spiritual connection to one another, to the world, and to life itself. And at that point, this is what also gave rise to the concept of, like Rob was saying, when we talk about beers and we talk about things that create a subtle aspect of sedation. Whereas when we go into it from the standpoint of talking about how something is used to raise the consciousness, that dosage that it takes for you to have a higher spiritual awareness and connection is a lot stronger than the dosage that it could take for somebody to just feel a little buzz, which would allow them to have a certain mental state of escapism. So it's two totally different concepts applied across the spectrum in order to be self-defeating. One is used as a weapon against the population. The other is used as a connection that we naturally had to nature for the sake of operating the way we did as a people, to stay in power with ourselves and the planet. One is a path to building, the other is a path to destruction. Absolutely. And so it's key, and I'm gonna close with this. It's a key that we realize that what Europeans did is came in and create an application of deceit that was based on exploitation, and exploitation itself was the commodity that was used, which led a inflow of the applications of things that apply to warfare that went beyond what we call directly attacking the tissue. In other words, what most people thought about in lands when it comes to war is basically, how can I destroy that flesh? How can I stop that person? Bam. So basically think of a spear, think of an arrow as you actually killing a person. Well, when I created a weaponization of the mind, then I moved beyond killing that actual person to a process that can actually control and manipulate a people in a society. That type of warfare is way more far-reaching than it is to just eliminate an individual. And when you realize that you take this to the psychological level, and you weaponize any and everything within the environment, from that standpoint, now what you create is a zombie culture. You create a zombie environment. Through zombies, you can have a way more powerful effect in terms of warfare than you can by eradicating and killing. Because when you create a zombie, now you can exploit that zombie, and you serve a dual purpose. One, you sedate them, which destroys the mental capacity to operate and think on the same level that you operate from. So therefore, now you emit psychological warfare, and you destroy their inner being to the point to where they are not able to consciously see and operate from a level of superiority. Now you create an inferior being, and you've attacked them from that level through the interjection of drugs at this point. And at that point, now you've also created an environment to where you can deploy that zombie and exploit it for its actual physical labor. So you have them sedated, and you have them mentally destroyed. And then from that standpoint, you can get them to do your bidding. So it takes on the use of the drugs, and the addictions at this point take on a whole new level. And then that leads into the concept again of addiction. Addiction is about codependency. When you create a codependency, you create a need. Creating that need goes into exploitation. This is why the concept of exploitation can be utilized so well in the quote unquote drug game, or street drug game. Because what you do is you introduce a product to somebody, you get them chemically addicted, and then from that standpoint, now they come to you to be exploited the very next time. And that exploitation will be self-fulfilling, and it will be set in perpetual motion. And so therefore, that zombie will constantly put itself back in the position to be exploited again and again and again. You see, and so we have to realize the weaponization of drugs and of the psyche, which is really the essence of what this is all about.
It's just thinking about the concept of zombie that you just introduced. Zombies, when they bite somebody else, that person becomes a zombie. So that's that thing, that self-perpetuating deal you're talking about. So this addict right here, other addicts make other people addicts, you know what I'm saying, to support their habit and to actually so you don't feel alone in your addiction. So not only does that zombie create one person, that zombie creates other people who create other zombies, because a numerous amount of men and women who have been turned out by other addicts, you know what I mean, just to be exploited, just to be used, just so they can they can feed that machine that keeps them coming back and keeps them not using their own mind.
I agree with you. I agree with you, brother Richard. But I want to kind of keep the focus on I think something that both myself and Brother Ward highlighted is the zombie is not self-created.
Oh no.
The zombie is produced. So even though the zombie bites the other person, quote unquote, who do we attribute that reproduction to? Do we attribute it to the zombie, or do we attribute it to the person who made the zombie? And that's where I think when we get to the point at this conversation, as we lift up what we could potentially be talking about as solutions, I think we have to keep that perspective in mind. I want to highlight another thought here. When Brother Watt was talking and he was referring to colonialism, although he didn't use the word colonialism, he was highlighting the way the European went into our native lands and they colonized the people. I was thinking about, I don't have any citations in front of me, but the missionaries, for example, they would precede the colonists. They would precede the warriors of the European armies. They would go in, and what they would do is they would study the people. They'd watch their culture, they'd learn their language, and they would do so with a very loving and delicate touch. They would do so with a genuine, it seemed, concern or empathy for or interest in the people. They would learn their language, they would dress the way that they dressed, and they would understand as much as they could to the extent that they could of that society, and they would write about it. And in their mind, they were writing about it to quote unquote educate their European brothers and sisters. But that person with a shrewd agenda, he took that insight, that knowledge, and he understood that he can infuse that understanding of that people with new ideas and new concepts that would distort the original meaning of that practice or tradition or way of that people. He could distort it for his own or her own purposes. So, for example, I read about how in India, and this is not something unique to India, but when the Catholics, for example, would go into a people, they would want to convert those people to their religion. And in order to do that, they decided a more strategic methodology would be not to come in and force that person or people to adopt their ways, like the conquistadors did. It's either you were going to submit or you're going to be killed. They decided to use syncretism, which was a subtle introduction of a new concept with an old concept. And that new concept would attach to that old concept would make the people comfortable with the adoption of that practice or idea. And before they knew it, they were involved with something that wasn't original to them. It wasn't germane to their identity. And they were now, the Europeans accepted them because they were looking at the end game. The end game was, at the end, I'm going to have my creation. Although it's going to take a bit of adjusting, I'm willing to be patient until that process is completed, because ultimately I want something that I can control. And inherent in that idea, I think, is something that we must, ponder on as we think about what solutions could be like or should be like. Because if we think it's just about dealing with the mind of the individual alone, without talking about the influences that come to him or her from the society around them, I think we'd be very off in our assessment. I want to read something before I pass the microphone to somebody else. This comes from a book entitled Justice Through Apologies, Remorse, Reform, and Punishment by Nick Smith, published by Cambridge Press. On page 129, there's the idea mentioned: attention to underlying causes, prevention over reaction. Now, the book is talking about crime, but I want you to think about this idea. And we really should have gone back and properly identified addiction. So I want to really quickly just mention a definition that I'm fond of from an author named Gabor Mate, who's the author of a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And I like his writing about addiction because he doesn't divorce addiction from trauma, the experiencing of trauma. And that's what essentially we've been describing when we talked about the European contact with our people and their transport to America, forcible transport to America. And then again, the domination and exploitation in America. And then again, their transport, their seemingly self-willed migration from the South to the North. But Gabor Mate says, my definition of addiction is any behavior that gives you temporary relief, temporary pleasure, but in the long term causes harm and has negative consequences. I think that's important to keep in mind. Now I want to read this. This is an analogy about crime and prevention, but I want you to think about our topic tonight. It's an analogy between preventative criminology and preventative medicine. A society with poor sanitation that breeds disease will need a lot of hospitals, some people think, in reaction to this illness or to these illnesses. Fixing the sanitation, thereby preventing the majority of the outbreaks. However, would not remove the underlying cause of the disease. So if we've got a lot of sickness in a community because there's bad plumbing or bad water, like what happened up in Flint, Michigan, the solution is not to build more hospitals to treat the people that are sick. The solution is to get down to work on the plumbing. It's the plumbing that's causing the sickness. It's the plumbing that's allowing to be disseminated through the water. It's the plumbing that's making the people sick. And so too with addiction in our society. When you think about slavery and you think about our contact with the European, you have to think about capitalism. You can't divorce one from the other. In those same ships that Africans were being transported to the Americas, in those same hulls, do you know what else was being transported? Alcohol.
Wrong.
Rum.
Mm-hmm.
And today, do you know one of the biggest industries in our society that's exploiting our people that few Black leaders even talk about? It's the tobacco industry and it's the alcohol industry. You look inside, I mean, which one of our communities can you drive down and not see a liquor store? Almost on every corner. You know, I live in a suburb area right now. I don't see any liquor store except in a shopping complex, and it's not near a neighborhood. But in my neighborhood growing up in New York City, I could walk to the corner store and I could buy alcohol as a youth. I could buy cigarettes as a youth. No one ever, considered that a problem. So I just wanted to introduce that, and I'll yield to anybody else who had a thought that they might want to share. Brother Richard, you might have something you want to say or give some input. I know that you've had some personal experiences in your own life with substance use. I call it substance use. That's the appropriate terminology when we're talking about it from a professional standpoint. But substance use, again, using that definition of wanting pleasure, but also ultimately causing yourself more pain and harsh consequences. I'll yield to you if you have anything you want to say.
Most definitely. I think about, the historical way or the cultural way that we used to use drugs, and, they would call them enhancements. And then all the population wasn't qualified to use these things. You had to go through certain rites of passages to actually be qualified to use this medicine, you know what I mean? To actually understand what the power, the potential of it. Mm-hmm. So I think about Brother Malcolm in his autobiography when he was talking about a brother named Jumpsteady. And Jumpsteady used to climb the side of these buildings, and he used to be, shimmying his way, breaking into people's houses. And Brother Malcolm said he found out later on that he was keyed up on dope. Like he would get on cocaine, and he would be able to pull these extraordinary feats of robbery, burglary, and whatnot. So, in a sense, Black people, we get on these drugs and living in a crimogenic society. These things actually become enhancements, you know what I mean? Or they become some type of stimulant or some type of suppression, depending on which direction your drug addiction or your drug use is going. So I see that before I actually got into, I got beyond recreational drug use, the weekend hangout drug thing. I never wanted to commit a crime high, because I was like, that's the prize. I want to get high after I commit the crime. But after a while, it just became, I just want to be high to be high. I'm gonna commit a crime high, and it actually became something more like, now it's not about the money anymore. Now it's about getting high. So the substance abuse and the chemical abuse that has gone on in my life, it when I committed the crime that I went to prison for, I was high in. So these so-called enhancements actually became something that actually took us off the path to being more aware. The path, and I say that to say that in the historical context, the people who were qualified to use these things did not let the general population use them. So for drugs to start becoming widespread and more used, you see where it actually affected us to the point to where they wanted everybody to use it, so you can have a higher misunderstanding, literally a higher misunderstanding, you know what I mean? So dealing with substances and watching my family dealing with substances.
Were you ever able to break free of it on your own? Like, did people tell you just stop? And what was your response to that when things like that transpired? When they would give you that argument, why don't you just stop? Or I stop, why can't you stop? How would you respond to those kinds of questions or demands?
Well, the thing was, in your mind, you feel like, well, man, I can stop. When you're addicted, you don't think you're addicted. You just think like, you thinking that if I stop, my world is gonna get better. You know what I mean? But in your mind, you like, well, you know, what's the purpose of it? It's not hurting me. What's hurting me is stopping. You know what I mean? So when I started to see people who, yeah, basically you start trying to avoid people who aren't on drugs. So you constantly get that confirmation bias in your immediate environment. Like, well, if I'm around people who are on drugs, who can tell you to stop? You know what I mean? So addicts tend to go with more addicts. You know what I mean? It's just like when I started smoking weed, all of a sudden I started being able to identify everybody who smoked weed. So when I started, popping pills, I started to recognize all the people who pop pills. Like you get introduced to a whole different group of people based on whatever drug it is. You know, I never got into cocaine or heroin or nothing like that. But I'm sure if I would have started using those things, I would have started seeing more addicts in that circle of life. You know what I mean? But
Yes.
you have family and stuff like that that want you to stop, and those are the people that you started to avoid because you just felt like there was no understanding there. There was no, I guess they identified the trauma. We don't know at the time. We don't know why we use it. We just like shit. This works, and it makes me feel better, and I don't see the reason to stop. You know what I mean? So yeah, it took me for a loop, and it's extremely difficult coming home because now drug use is like it's the thing. If you ain't turning up, if you ain't popping pills or getting high, getting lit, then you ain't living your best life. You know what I mean? So
And let me mention this for the sake of first of all, thank you for sharing your insights and your personal insights at that. You know, I want to say clearly, I'm not against drug use.
No.
Generally, people and everybody that uses drugs doesn't become an addict. I think that's something we need to state, to be fair.
No doubt.
For me, however, I realized that I could not live my optimum life continuing in the patterns that I had developed since a youth. And I realize now that a lot of my patterns that I developed was a reaction to what was going on in my household, which was also a reaction of what was happening to their lives in a racist society.
No doubt.
And so for me, recovery is resistance. To the degree that I learned to resist the influences that have negatively shaped my life, my family's life, and the society that we live in, that's where my new high comes from.
No doubt.
I don't need a chemical any longer to stimulate the most pleasurable responses to the world around me. When I am in this moment, just for example, being in this space with you brothers, dissecting something, trying to grapple with the challenges of our time and day, there is in that a pleasure that can't be matched by any turning up or sipping or whatever you want to call it today. And this is the message that I hope to impart to the young people around me. And like some of the religious folk will tell them, try it. Try this life. That's what I would say to them. Try this life and see if it doesn't produce for you the same thing I'm telling you is produced for me. My antidote for my addiction has been community. To the degree that I've learned to accept and be a part of my community and not make myself out to be some lone ranger, self-made man. And again, I emphasize that because in with our contact with Europeans, everything about the way we thought about the world changed. Not just our use of chemicals or plants or medicine for medicinal purposes, spiritual purposes, but even how we saw ourselves. Whereas in Africa, we looked at ourselves as a collective. In the West, with the contact with Western Europeans, we began to look at ourselves as individuals. And the individual became more important than the collective. And that's why you hear today young folk talking about, let me do me. I'm gonna do me and you do you. And so for me, recovery is about reminding my young people, reminding myself and reminding those around me that we are connected to each other. what happens to you affects me. What happens to me affects you. When you are injured, I feel the pain. And getting back to that sense of awareness will make me pause when I properly think about what the brother tells me, that my behavior has a ripple effect in my community. So if I'm putting something out that's harming my neighbor, that's harming my community, then I have to question whether or not this is something that I need to continue to engage in, if in fact I properly see myself as a part of that community. And that's again the thing we have to begin to think about. Many of these young people out here in the community today, they don't see themselves as a part of community. So that's why it's easy for them to say, I'm an individual. And that message, and somebody I'm sure is going to talk about it in a moment, and I'm going to yield to that. You know, I learned there were messages that I acquired about my identity as a Black man when I was incarcerated that I never heard when I was in prison. Why is it that in prison I heard that message and not in the community? I offer this theory that is because the majority of those brave brothers and sisters that believed in that message got locked up. And it was in that prison context that message was disseminated. I remember in federal prison coming in contact with some old typed up documents, and all the words were typed in capital letters. And I was like, who wrote this? And it seemed like it had just been something that was copied and passed on and on and on. And I didn't even know the names that were on some of these documents until later down the line. I started studying about the history of the movement. And I remember thinking about one name that was very prominently displayed on a lot of these documents I came across, and it was the name Mutulu Shakur. May he rest in power. It wasn't until I got incarcerated that I came in contact with the knowledge of this system that I love that the brother said that was used against us. And we often, like he said, misquoted, but I like what he said. He called it the counterintelligence program. We usually use the metaphor, the abbreviated form of it, COINTELPRO. And I wonder why that one has become more of use, because I think it's what Brother War is saying. It was a counterintelligence program. And I'll say this in yield. If I remember 1984, this is a bit of personal story. I remember going to look for some ganja. We say in New York, some ganja, some reefer. In 1984, I was looking for some reefer in my community, and I could not find any weed anywhere except some backyard boogie. And all of a sudden, yeah, that was it. That's all I could find. Every door I knocked on, it was like, man, all I got is some backyard boogie, man. Somebody was growing it. I'm like, nah, I want some of that Humboldt County stuff, man. They was like, nah, we ain't got none, man. It was like, it was all dried up. It was a drought. And the next thing I knew, everybody was talking about this rock. I was like, man, what's this rock? And then my stepbrother came from New York and he was like, here, man, try this. First time I said no. Second time I said no. Third time I saw him blow the smoke out, I got curious. Curiosity took the best of me. I tried it. I didn't last 6 months on the streets after that. I was 14 years old. I was addicted to crack cocaine. And the rest of my years, 21 years of my life, to some extent or another, have always been returning to the prison as a result of putting the stuff back in my system. But the point I was trying to make, and I yield with this point, that led me to these men in prison who began to teach me of this history that was almost destroyed because they locked away all those leaders. I know somebody's going to be talking about how, Nixon, Tricky Dick, he instituted the war on drugs in 1972. If you listen to his secret recordings, he said, let's blame the niggas and let's blame the hippies. And what was his provocation for using the hippies and the niggas? He said, because they used the drugs. And we can use that as a predicate to attack their movement and destroy that movement because they're fighting against the war, and we can't have this. We can't have them destabilizing our society. So these are things that we have to think about today. I know people want to have their enjoyment, but we have to put this all in context if we're going to properly respond to what's happening at our time and day as it relates to addiction and as it relates to all the other extending problems that grow from that. I'll yield the floor.
Let me jump in real quick and use some of the words you stated to elaborate so that people understand the words, because I like to make sure people realize that the words we state, words are power. Words are power. And
yes, sir.
why it's referred to as spelling is because it's spellcast. So when we talk about reactionary, or when we react from something, remember, in the realm of drugs, reaction is based on taking something for the sake of pleasure, escape, or suppression from reality. So when drugs are used for that reason, then it is a self-defeating, self-destructive, or death cycle. Period. It is a death cycle. So anything that you quote unquote are going to gain from using drugs for the sake of being reactionary is going to be counter to your development. But if you're being revolutionary, then it's going to be used, drugs, or should I say medicine at that point, will be used for the advancement, connection, and awareness of where you are, when you are, how you are, and who you are. It is a totally different sphere of operation. One is suppression, one is reactionary, the other one is revolutionary, advancement, and an interconnection. Just like Rob talked about when he talked about the projection of the individual. That is the reason why you create recreational drugs. It's escapism and individuality patterns. But when you deal with something from the standpoint of connection and unification and synchronization, it's not the same. So going back to where we were, that is what deals with an aspect of solution. I talk more on that, but I want to pick back up on actually what he was saying in regards to the war on drugs, because what we have to realize as a people, and I think this is where a lot of the disconnect is that we are in a war. The war on drugs. Let's take this back to the 50s and 60s. J. Edgar Hoover realized that the African community, the Black community, were dealing with self-determination. We're realizing that, look, the only way we're going to be able to get things to operate the way they should is that we do for self. As the Black community realized and operated from that position and dealt with self-determination, then J. Edgar Hoover wanted to come in and find a way to destroy that. When we talk about the creation of the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party for self-defense came together for the sake of addressing police brutality. The awareness of that and the realization that, look, we have the power in ourselves to prevent cops from being able to attack us and to prevent law enforcement from being able to brutalize and destroy our communities and attack our communities. So Ronald Reagan, governor at that time in California, basically sat out and created a law to prevent weapons from being able to be carried in the public. So they thought they was winning that war. But what that actually ended up doing was changing the focus of the Black Panther Party to more of the political process that created the oppression in the first place. So it backfired. And at this point is when J. Edgar Hoover realized that the Black Panther Party was public enemy number one of the United States of America, because they are what? Now taking focus on politicizing the next generation. So when the Black Panther Party was dealing with the self-development programs and created liberation schools, now all of a sudden what you're doing is the Black community is doing what it needs to do to create what was referred to then as survival programs and living programs, in terms of us depending on our own to create our own. And as we did that, what happened from there is that we politicized our youth, and we was raising a consciousness of the next generation to be able to step in and naturally fight the fight against oppression. Okay. So in essence, what needed to be done now was to find a way to attack the unification and the synchronization of the Black community. So there comes the concept of the counterintelligence program, the counter consciousness initiative. With those, what you did is you created a situation to where there was now going to be government funding that can be deployed and utilized by the local enforcement agencies in order to do their bidding and create an all-out illegal attack against the Black community learning how to operate and deal with self-determination. And it was done under the guise of quote unquote communism, which is basically their way of trying to say that the Russians were influencing these organizations to, or in these people to operate on this level.
like a bait and switch.
Yeah. And that's just to get the average white person to buy along with what was going on, because they were fearing the concept of nuclear war or atomic war at the time. So the next stage was, now that the United States government declared this war, and this is also when the police department became militarized. What people don't realize is that that's when the funding came in. That's when the funding came in to start militarizing the local police departments. Also with that, what the police departments, what the government realized it needed to do was co-opt these programs of self-development and self-determination, and now make these government programs. So once they done that, now they stripped the Black community of its power, because now what you did is you created another codependency, again, which is a weaponization, a tool of destruction against the Black community, is create that same thing that, like Rob talked about, where the mercenaries will come in and neutralize our spiritual connection by creating and getting us to co-adopt a different spiritual system. Now all of a sudden you do the same thing, and you create a codependency to where now, instead of us depending on each other, we go back to the government for these resources. But catch 22 in terms of the weaponization is that you had to have a split family in order to receive certain types of benefits. So it set the stage for the destruction of the Black family. It set the stage for the codependency that we have, which would take us away from self-determination. So now comes moving into the 70s, Hollywood jumps into the game, and they start working with the government and creating the Black exploitation. This is where you bring in the glorification of the pimps, players, prostitutes, and pushers, the P's. So from that standpoint, now Hollywood created this stereotype that would exploit and would create this image that would attract the youth to the negative stereotypes, which would further divide the Black community to also coming off the back of what people didn't realize, Black people didn't realize was through desegregation, they figured out a way to weaponize that. And by weaponizing that, they created a simulation. And by creating a simulation, now Hollywood comes in and makes sure that the elements left within the communities would be the exploitative elements. Again, the exploitation. Now you take exploitation and make it a commodity, and the pimp and the prostitute and the pusher are all exploiting what's left of the communities. And by doing so, you could further destroy what was going to be of the community. And then you get the youth now that are glorifying and finding these stereotypes that were created and emphasized and pushed onto the Black community as heroes and sheroes. So now the youth are creating a further level of disconnection and disillusion upon their lifestyles. Then now you can come right in and create this agency called the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, and now you can declare a war on drugs, because you've had a war on the Panther Party, you had a war on the community, you had the war on the Black unity, and once that was misogynized and set into place, now you create this falsification concept called war on drugs, and then you flood the Black community with dope so that you can fund the Contra wars that was going on. And then the CIA got its involvement, and therefore the CIA operating, creating these Black Op programs so that they can have, again, a dual purpose operation. One was to flood the Black community with drugs. Two was able to make money in operations through the destruction of the Black community to deal with external wars that were being fought from outside the United States. So you had a dual purpose. Now keep this in mind, because this is one of the things that we have to really realize that is going on all throughout this stuff, is that our enemy is learning how to maximize warfare, so that it's not just one way that they attack you, but they're able to attack you on multiple fronts all at once. So as we even dive into the concept of solutions, we cannot be tunnel vision and only think that there is one approach and one way for a solution to operate. The same way weapons that are formed against us are able to hit us on multiple fronts. is the same way we have to approach solutions. So now when they come in, and again, leading from the 70s into the 80s, and you start adding codependency and chemical addiction into the fold, what you're doing at this point is you're setting the stage from in the 60s, whereas you was attacking the element of community factor and unification of the community. And then in the 70s, you come in and you destroy the family structure. And then you also create the individualism, and you create the hype of the negative stereotypes. And then in the 80s, you move in and you sedate the population, and you create these addictions that will, from that point forward, be able to use, again, from a two-strike method, is you're destroying the communities by flooding and creating addictions. And at the same time, now you're creating cheap slave labor, and also making it a maximum punishable crime when you get caught with the same thing that the CIA gave you and flooded the streets in the first place. The same thing that Hollywood glorified in the first place. You see, so we're getting hit from all these different angles and don't realize this is the key element, that we are dealing with war. We are under attack. And because we're not looking at these addictions as being weapons of warfare, oftentimes when we talk about solutions, we don't realize that the solution also has to be applied to a warfare point of view and strategy. If we are at war, then our solutions have to be applied to being a soldier on a battlefield and have to be deployed from a position of being at war. And so therefore, realize that the individualism that Rob talked about is a product of a weaponized point of view that's created to make you be a reactionary and an individual, and to not see the bigger picture, going back to counterintelligence and counter consciousness, making sure that not only do you not see the bigger picture, but you are attracted to everything that opposes you ever coming up out of that position. And then from you moving from the 80s to the 90s, now for one, you started having Hollywood exploitation that comes into play, and now you start utilizing when back in the 70s, especially in areas like New York, when gang banging was real high and strong, and they started using musical culture in order to find ways to counter being able, attacking each other and creating gangs. Now the exploitation of that music as a subculture was starting to be employed and used against the people. And so they then turn around and use rap, referred to originally as hip hop at that point, against the population, and started creating these exploitative methodologies in the music industry. And so you create this concept of called gangster rap. And then gangster rap came in and got glorified, and you continue to sedate and sleep a whole new generation of people. And then you re-expose them, especially in the West Coast, you expose a new generation to Black exploitation films like Superfly, The Mac, and all that, and you bring back that same element and you glorify that again. So now you have a whole population that is attracted to chemical dependency, attracted to being exploited, attracted to being consumers, and pulled away from anything that connects us back to the community. All of these things, people, are direct weapons and tools of warfare being used against us intentionally. And I know some of the stuff may sound like conspiracy, but Maxine Waters, going back to what Brother Rob was talking about, blew it out the box and brought it out in the open that the CIA was directly involved in crack cocaine being distributed throughout the Black communities and across the United States. It is an open and shut case at this point. But most people don't realize that, so they don't realize that these are weapons of war that's being deployed on the general population.
I don't know if Brother Syke or Brother Richard has anything else to add. I just want to make a quick comment, if that's all right, Brother Syke. Is that fine?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much for that overview, Brother War. I want to kind of shift gears into solutions, because I can hear some Black folks say, well, we know the problems. We talk about the problems all the time. This is another problems video. No, this is not another problems video. We're trying to give you context. And the hope is that if you listen and you're patient enough to take time to investigate the things that are being offered, that you might see the merit of what we're saying. What freed me? I suggested it a moment ago when I talked to you about coming into contact with certain information. As I began this journey, and what journey was I on? I was on a journey for myself. I was on a journey for my identity. I had been told, as Brother War suggested, already not suggested, as he outright stated about the gangsterism, I had been told by my peers at my time coming up, little nigga, you's a gangster. Some told me, you're a hustler. Others told me, nah, man, you know, you this or you that. And because my father wasn't imparted to me the knowledge that I most needed him to share with me, which was who was he and who had he come from? And where did we come from? And how did we get here? Those are the questions that I needed answers to. Because but by him failing to give me that, I was now subjected to hearing the solutions, or rather the input of my peers. And my peers have been corrupted. So now I'm in prison, and I'm like that character on Batman and Robin. What's that cat which he's got all the question marks on his shirt? What's he called?
The Riddler.
The Riddler. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm like the Riddler. I'm walking around with question marks coming up all out of me. I want to know the answer. Who am I? And I was doggedly determined to find the answer to that, because without that answer, I was anything that this world wanted me to be. And I was tired of being somebody else's mad experiment. I needed the truth. And it was a process. I didn't just arrive at an answer just because I read a book, or arrive at an answer because I joined a group. I often learned that a lot of times you have to read more than one book. You have to read book after book after book to get to the truth. And you may join a group, but it may be that the group doesn't have the answer that you're looking for. I didn't stop. I became determined to find the answers that I needed. And I'll say to you today, at 52 years of age, I'm still on a journey. I haven't arrived anywhere. I'm still very much in quest of not myself anymore, but actualizing myself to its highest potential. I have knowledge of myself today, but I realize that I'm not able to fully experience this with the challenges that restrict me, like parole, for example. Parole is not freedom. It's conditional release from incarceration. I had to pull out that point. So going back to my suggestion about solutions, so I'm going to use my own story as a way to suggest what happened. I began to read about these great figures in history, these liberators, these liberation fighters. And as I began to read these people's stories, and I'm talking about, I would pour over page after page of stories about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, L'Ouverture, and on. The list goes on. Once I read these stories, there was something inside of me that turned on and convinced me that I was connected to that story. And I learned that that story at its root was a quest for our people to regain what was taken from us, called freedom. And because I wanted to be a part of this story, I asked myself, how was I today contributing to it or taking away from it? And the more I began to ponder what it meant to take away from this long legacy of a quest for freedom, the more I became disenchanted with the images and ideas I had adopted over the years, calling myself that. I wanted to be a fighter for freedom. And I realized that I could not do that simultaneously being a destroyer of myself and my community. I couldn't be a liberator while I was bringing people the products that were causing their death. So I had to grapple with a decision I needed to make. I had to grapple with what I wanted to do. Now, what I wanted to do, I realized ultimately it was on my own, it was insurmountable. On my own, I couldn't get to where I was trying to go. And so what I needed to do was I needed to grab a hold of other people that had already been telling me they loved me. And the more that I recognized that these people loved me, the more I became free. I want to read something to you as I pass the microphone to the next speaker. One of the things I came across in my years of studying was that those that are called addicts today, they're looking for something like I was looking for something. And at the heart of their quest, they were looking for love. They were looking for belonging. And they were looking for something to be a part of. I'm going to take too long to find what I wanted to quote, so I'll just use what I've just said to just conclude with this. The addict is looking for love, my brothers. They're looking for someone to accept them. And when you find yourself in a community of people that you could just simply do what you want to do with, and no one judges you, it feels like love, but it's a confused form of love. Love does not allow me to harm myself. Love tells me, brother, pause and take a look at what you're doing. You might want to reconsider. That's what love does. And love doesn't do that with a belligerent and a paternalistic voice. Love does that from a place of genuine empathy. I finally stopped listening to the world and I started listening to the voice of love that came to me from the people around me that cared about me and desperately wanted me to be the best version of myself. I'm in that place today because I no longer have a distorted image of what love is. My gang did not love me. My homies did not love me. That was a substitute for love. Real love is the love that I have laying in that back room, that accepts my imperfections, that doesn't expect me to be a perfect example of humanity because she knows I'm flawed. Real love is the brother that's welcomed me onto his production and allowed my voice to go out to other people because his love is showing me trust. And that moves me in a way that no beat down or no chemical could ever move me in the past. And so I just want to say to those that are out there that might be struggling, listen to those around you that really do care about you. And you know who they are. They're the ones that you really don't want to listen to, but you, in your heart, you know what, I want to listen to them. And when you listen to them, stop talking inside of your head and just be patient and allow their words to pour into your heart. Because my brothers and sisters, if you're struggling, you can't do it on your own. You need a community. And so I'll just yield there and say, my solution is resistance to oppression. The more we learn as a community, not as individuals, but as a community to resist oppression, the greater our chances are to reclaim the brokenness in our communities. Your kid can't be your kid anymore. He's got to be my kid, his kid, his kid, and his kid too. Your woman, of course, she's got to be your woman. But I got to be concerned just as much about you in that affair called a relationship as I'm concerned about mine. Brother, what's going on? I heard y'all arguing the other day. I know you're not over there putting your hands on that woman. That we've got to get back to that place where we're concerned about each other with that kind of profound and genuine love. Because we've got problems that we're asking folk to deal with as if they're personal problems. And the reality is they're social problems. And the solution doesn't come from within themselves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on your mind? Come on, anything you want to say?
Well, I want you to look for that passage that you wanted to read, and when you
Okay.
get it, you can let me know.
I'll go ahead
I'm
and
gonna
look for it right now. Thank you.
all right. Appreciate you, brother. I'm gonna go back just a little bit. I haven't said anything because War talked for like an hour and a half earlier. But but you know, y'all said a few things
Let him
that
make
caught
it.
my
Let him
attention.
make it.
Y'all caught my attention. I want to talk about War talked about addiction as war. And I'm gonna talk about that a little bit. Then I want to go back to this because Brother Rob just said something that touched me. You know, when you're dealing with addiction, because while I have never personally dealt with addiction from that point of view, I can't remember a time in my life where I didn't have a loved one around that was dealing with addiction, and I attempted to find ways in order to build with them and help them, or for lack of a better word, coerce them out of it and never could. But I'm gonna go back when War was talking about drugs being war, and y'all went to Nixon and Ronald Reagan and things of this nature. See, the American government knows, or at least used it as propaganda. They recognize that drugs can be used as a form of warfare. When the American government wanted to justify their need to go after Pablo Escobar in Colombia, they threatened the Colombian government by telling them, if y'all don't get Escobar, we're going to view you as basically being in collusion with Escobar to send cocaine to America. And we have just passed a new law that states that when you dump large quantities of drugs on a population, it's like dropping a bomb. And that gives us the right to enact war against Colombia. Well, with that threat, Colombia needed to go after Escobar. Because before that, they wasn't going after Escobar. Had they even elected him to Congress. You know what I'm saying? So when you understanding history puts everything in perspective, put everything you're looking at in perspective. And War talked about earlier about the DEA. It wasn't called the DEA at first. I can't remember the name of it. But when they made certain drugs illegal, certain drugs were made
I think it was the
illegal.
Bureau of Internal Affairs. I think. I'm
It
not
was the
sure.
Bureau of Internal Affairs.
I think.
When they made drugs illegal, you got to understand why. There are certain countries that cocaine just grows from the ground like a weed does in my yard, or marijuana just naturally grows from the ground. And these drugs, so-called drugs or substances, can be cash crops for these countries. These countries are third world nations right now. But if if the drugs that grows naturally in their land wasn't put under certain schedules of illegal drugs, they would be extremely wealthy countries right now today. Hell, Pablo Escobar was the seventh richest man in the world and during his time, during his heyday. And his accountant actually said that Forbes called him that simply based off his land ownership. If they accounted for the yayo, then he probably would have been number two. You know what I'm saying? But like give you an example. Cocaine used to be, when cocaine was legal, cocaine was actually in Coca-Cola. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's real. Even the Coke can is actually the Peruvian flag. That's what the Coke can was. They took cocaine out when they made it illegal and put caffeine in it. And the original name was Peruvian cola. That was the original name for, they called it Coca-Cola. But
No.
it was in Coca-Cola.
That's
They used
correct.
to use cocaine in dentist office to numb your mouth, whenever they were doing surgery and oral surgery and things of this nature. So just imagine if cocaine and weed and marijuana and things like this was legal, and imagine what the economy of countries like Peru, Colombia, I can't remember the other four that grows it naturally, but imagine what the economies would look like.
They'd
Then
be rivaling the United States of America.
Exactly. So that was a political move. That was a war move to stifle those people's economy. Same way the American government did Cuba when they put the trade embargoes on Cuba. Cuba is poor because of trade embargoes that have been placed on Cuba. But going back to the point, same thing that happened in the during the crack era. This, like War was saying, it's not a conspiracy theory. This is real. And I'm not saying the show is real, but even the show Snowfall is based on this reality. The Snowfall is based on, everybody talk about Franklin Saint, who was based after the real Rick Ross, who got famous for who got famous for uh, 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 basically exporting and was called a crack king and exporting crack cocaine all throughout the Americas. And this
So
was happening.
that's who that show's based on.
The show is based
Rick
off Rick
Ross?
Ross. Yeah, the real Rick Ross. You know who the rapper took his name out. Yeah,
I
the
know
show
you're
is
talking
based
about.
off him. And
Yeah.
he didn't even realize he was selling the CIA's drugs until he was in prison. He didn't even
Yeah,
know it.
and I
Yeah.
remember as a youth in juvenile, his name being mentioned by the kids in juvenile.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
before this is before. Remember, I grew up partly in California, so I remember the kids talking about his name. So that's how prominent his name was, even in the juvenile institutions. His name was being mentioned.
Mhm.
So that was quite a story. Yeah.
So they used him as a pawn in order to get and if you look at the movie Panther, for instance, they got the dude that played Ezekiel, I can't remember, AJ Johnson. They got him playing a character that actually represents that pawn that's used. Here it is, I offer you personally, individually, wealth and power in your community by selling these drugs. And that solves your individual problem. But you don't understand that I'm using, you probably don't give a damn that I'm using you as a pawn to spread my drugs throughout your neighborhood so that I can neutralize the black power base. So I can neutralize it and bring it to a standstill. And that's what was happening. That's what was happening during that time that made the crack era hit. Now I'm gonna say this one more thing, and brother Rob just let me know he found the page. I'm gonna let him read it. But like brother Rob talked about at 14 when he was introduced to crack. Now this is something that you have to think about and have to truly understand that in that era when crack first hit, people didn't have an understanding of the effect that crack was gonna have.
No, we did not.
People was using cocaine, just like you love to smoke weed today. They
Yeah.
looked at it like that. They didn't know this was supposed to be a pandemic. They didn't understand it. The cocaine, coca leaves was chewed by the people of Southern America for hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years. This was just a normal part of their culture. They didn't process it though. They would just simply take the leaf off the plant and just chew it like kind of like chewing tobacco. And they use it as like an energy drink to a certain degree. But it's with the processing that the chemical processing that the plant itself becomes stronger. You turn it from the coca plant into coca paste. Now, and when it's turned to coca paste and then processed to become cocaine, the actual name for this thing, they would call it cocaine hydrochloride. That's what it's called. Now, let me explain the differences between the two, and why crack cocaine is more addictive than powder cocaine. And I'm not justifying the improper scheduling sentencing differences that the feds used to use. I'm not justifying that, but I just want us to look at this. Cocaine hydrochloride was basically the powder that you're snorting. And it might give you a high for like, let's say 60 minutes, but it takes a while for it to kick in. It don't kick in as fast as it does when you smoke it or if you inject it. Now, the thing about when you rock it up, you might think to yourself, man, you add baking soda and water. Why does that? And I ain't trying to teach nobody how to cook no crack. Why does this make it a stronger drug? But when you cook it, when you chemically process it, what happens is you burn out the hydrochloride and you leave the cocaine without the hydrochloride. That's why originally they called crack or rock a free base, because the base is the hydrochloride and it freed it of the base, it removed it. And then you have the cocaine that's just riding on a cooked up baking soda, which crystallized it into the rock. And then when you smoke it, the feeling is almost instantaneous, but it lasts a shorter amount of time than it does when you smoke it. So the as y'all talked about zombies earlier, you're constantly seeking that high. That high came, you like, God, that's the best feeling I've had in my life. Then it's gone. I need that, and I need to stay there. And that's why this drug, this new form of chemically processed drug, flooded the black community. I mean, I watched this, and I was growing up. I was a kid during the crack era, and I was growing up watching it. So a lot of people in my era looked down on crack because of the fact that we was able to see what it does, what it did. Our partners' mothers would be out giving kids our age oral sex just to get some rock.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It had that type of effect, and it had the type of effect where it got to the point where some people's full focus was on getting high. You know what I'm saying? You would have friends of mine, and sometimes in my own household, everything you own was getting sold. The food stamps was getting sold. The lights was not on. The water was not on. You got all these food stamps coming every month, but we don't have no food in the refrigerator because mama's focus is getting high. Mama's focus is the next hit. And people don't have an ideal of how their addiction is affecting their loved ones, especially their children. When you're a child growing up in a household like this, and I got innumerable friends and partners that I grew up with that suffered from this, who had to go to other partners' houses just to eat because there wasn't no food in their refrigerator, who was going to other partners' house, sneaking in the window to take baths because the water was not on. And the parents, I don't think, was understanding the effect that their addiction was having on their children. And ironically, a lot of these children, like Brother Rob was talking about, understanding the difference between the social effect and the individual effect. I don't know if those are the exact words you use, but
That's close enough. Social problem and a personal problem.
yeah, exactly. Social problem, personal problem. A lot of these kids who was not old enough to get jobs because of the child labor laws in this country, but was old enough to need to eat, would actually start selling the very substance that was destroying their household because it would feel my need to eat and have lights on right now. These kids would become the men of the house. These kids who didn't understand, didn't have the maturity, the mental maturity of a man, became the men of the house because they had the money. And one of the things that we all know, and I'm surprised, brother, he ain't said nothing on this yet, is that capitalism in a capitalist system, having the money promotes you to king status. If you got the money, you can do all the talking. You know what I'm saying? They say it's the golden rule. Who has the gold makes the rule. But brother Rob, what's up with that quote you said you was looking for?
And I do apologize, brothers, but I have to, after this quotation, I'm going to have to remove myself from the discussion. It's only because I have a family member that requires my presence.
All right, brother. We appreciate you for coming on.
So thank you very much. I want to just say that from now. Say thank you all for your input on this topic, which is very important to me. And I do hope that we could at some point have another conversation, maybe building on what we've done tonight, amplifying some of the things that we pointed out and being more precise even for those that are following this channel and continuing to tune in and listen. And again, for those of you who haven't yet subscribed, go to that button right there and subscribe tonight to the channel, Panther 48.
True indeed. True indeed.
So
it costs you nothing to subscribe and constantly get all this different knowledge and this information. And it will cost you even less to hit that like button. Go ahead,
That's
brother
right.
Rob.
That's right. Thank you. So I'm reading this everything I've read from tonight. I've given you the title. This one I'm going to give you the title also. A New Guide for Christian Counseling, Caring for People God's Way, Personal and Emotional Issues, Addiction, Grief, and Trauma. Now, I read all kinds of books. I take things from anywhere I can get the information from. And when I came across this, I thought it was profound, despite the source that it comes from. Page 258 is under the title of Addictions. Addicts don't know a better life. In most cases, addicts don't know true love and intimacy. They don't know a true relationship. Now, the book's going to say with God, but I want to say with the people. Addictions are embraced as the perverse substitutes, false love and false intimacy. So it encourages counselors to give the counseled a true vision of spirit and of love. One of the great challenges in working with addicts is in helping them exchange the short-term highs for the long-term intimacy with their God and with others, which is so much more satisfying than the highs of any addiction. When the Jewish people wanted to return to Egypt and lives as slaves rather than go to the promised land, it was Joshua who reminded them to depend on God. Christian counselors are suggested that they will need to be like Joshua, Leaders like Joshua can also be found in those recovering people who have achieved a number of years in sobriety. These recovering people have assembled a more serene life and testimony of their being freed and their ongoing work as leaders and those who practice love. I share that with you because I believe ultimately that those that are closest to the pain should be driving the change. Those folk who have experienced the things that you just described, Brother Syke, those things that you've gone through, Brother Richard, in your own life and witnessed probably in your own household, those things that I saw, and I'm pretty certain that almost every one of us on this call has seen. We know what this thing has done in our communities. My call for you is to look at it not at, I think about the kids you just described, Brother Syke, and I think about, you said they couldn't understand. I heard a minister once say, children are good observers, but they're poor interpreters. They see the world around them, but they don't understand the world around them. So you go ask that young guy, why is he doing what he's doing today? The first thing that's going to come out of his mouth, I've said it myself, man, it's my mama, it's my dad. It's their fault. They never stop because they don't know to stop and think about the conditions that shape the choices that their mother and their father made. And that's the main point that I wanted to bring home tonight. I cannot talk about addiction without talking about white supremacy. And I cannot think about recovery unless I think about being in resistance to oppression. These have to be thought about if we're going to talk about this issue, instead of talking about the victims of these phenomenon and blaming that person and saying that it's all on that individual to get out of the condition that they may find themselves in. True enough, they have to get out of it. And true enough, I'll give you this one last story as I go. There were some frogs that were journeying down the road of life, and they were hopping along, ribbit, and one of the frogs got stuck in the mud. And so the other frogs tried everything they could to pull that frog out of the mud, and try as they might, they could not pull that frog out of the mud. So they hopped on their way down the road, and about a day later, they were hopping back after they came from swimming in the pond, as frogs do, and they came across the frog that they had left, and they couldn't get out, hopping down the road coming towards them. And they said, "Frog, what happened? We thought you were stuck in the mud." And the frog answered them and said, "Yeah, I was stuck in the mud until a truck came down the road and I had to get out." Some of our people are not going to get free until they realize they have no choice. They're either going to get rolled over by the forces that are coming to destroy them, or they're going to be freed. They're going to use every bit of strength and grit that they have to remove themselves from that reality. For me, what that looked like was me taking the last bit of strength I had and reaching my hand out and saying, "Help me, man. Pull me up." Humbling myself and realizing I couldn't do it alone. I didn't have the solution, but I did have the willingness to begin the journey. And that's what I offer to you tonight. Those of you that might be struggling with this phenomenon, you don't have to have the solution, but you do have to have the willingness. And that willingness is an internal process. Motivation is an inside out job. You got to look inside yourself and ask yourself, am I living my most optimum life? And if this is not the life that you want, then just find the willingness to say to yourself, I'm ready to do something else, but I know I can't. Somebody, look for somebody, help me. Help me get to where I want to go, because I can't get there on my own. And I believe that when that happens, as the saying goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will arrive.